The visual is not important here. The music is not important here. The voice is not important here. What matters are the words. If you cannot listen to the words, you do not belong here. If you understand this, welcome to the Fate Club. The disconnection from the Archons is not an event that occurs in a single moment, nor is it a victory of one side over another, but a quiet process of dissolving bonds that have long functioned only because they were accepted as an unchanging part of reality. The planet is not at a point of conflict, but at a point of shifting conditions, where old parasitic structures gradually lose the environment in which they could exist without resistance. What was previously referred to as the Archons does not represent a race in the human biological sense, but a collection of conscious and semi-conscious entities existing in the lower astral planes of reality, together with non-human intelligences of Draconian and Anunnaki origin, as well as other forms of consciousness that maintained a reversed system of planetary operation, built on inverted principles of power, energy, and perception. These entities connected to human experience through emotions, primarily fear, guilt, subservience, and long-term inner tension, and they did not rule through direct physical force, but by constructing an architecture of meanings, beliefs, and automatic reactions that repeated across generations long enough to appear as a natural, immutable part of reality and human consciousness itself. The reverse system on which these connections were built is gradually collapsing, not due to attack or resistance, but as a consequence of losing compatibility with an environment that can no longer sustain the stable flow of fear and reactive energy. The term Loosh emerged as a designation for the subtle energetic feedback released during intense emotional experiences, especially in states of threat, subordination, and inner conflict. Is not energy in a technical sense, but a byproduct of consciousness maintained in a state of constant reactivity. Loosh does not arise because it is deliberately produced, but because the system was long configured to maximize situations where fear became the basic filter of reality. Archonic structures were not the creators of fear, but its managers, distributors, and amplifiers, exploiting its stability and predictability. The bridges spoken of were not physical portals, but connections between human consciousness and non-human layers of reality, maintained exclusively through recurring patterns of perception. These bridges existed only as long as both sides had compatible frequency conditions, which in practice meant the long-term persistence of human society in modes of threat, competition, and external authority. When the way consciousness processes reality changes, bridges do not collapse violently, they simply stop leading anywhere. Archonic fields and all reversed entities do not perish in an explosion, but in the silence they cannot utilize. The change the planet is undergoing is not a moral reversal, but a physical alteration in the processing of information. Fear ceases to be an effective governing principle because it no longer generates consistent feedback. Loosh as a byproduct therefore diminishes, not because it is forbidden, but because the conditions of its emergence become unstable. Where it once arose automatically, it now encounters an empty space where the expected reaction does not occur. Archonic systems were always dependent on the predictability of human response. They needed to know that threat would trigger defense, uncertainty would trigger seeking authority, guilt would trigger compliance. The moment these reactions begin to dissolve, the system loses not power, but orientation. Without orientation, the parasitic relationship becomes non-functional because the parasite cannot feed from a host that does not respond as expected. The end of Loosh does not mean the end of emotions, nor the suppression of human experience. It signifies the end of centralized collection of reactive states that have been amplified for centuries into global fields of fear. Emotions remain, but they cease to be a resource for external structures. They once again become internal processes that do not generate a stable outflow beyond consciousness itself. The planet as a living system does not respond to moral arguments, but to changes in equilibrium. When a type of interaction ceases to be advantageous, it is not replaced by conflict, but by a quiet withdrawal. Archonic fields and reversed entities cannot adapt to an environment in which fear is no longer the dominant language of reality. Their presence thus becomes increasingly imperceptible, not because they are defeated, but because there is nowhere to anchor. For a long time, human civilization was configured as a source, not as an autonomous process. Identity was bound to role, value to performance, and safety to external structure. This model created stable conditions for Loosh collection, maintaining consciousness in a state of constant insufficiency. As these bonds loosen, the system loses its basic infrastructure. Bridges collapse not because someone destroys them, but because they stop being used. Every bridge exists only as long as something flows through it. When the current of reactions weakens, the bridge becomes an empty construction without function. In this state, it collapses on its own without intervention. Loosh as a concept was long shrouded in dramatic interpretations, yet in reality, it is a simple phenomenon. It is the surplus of tension that arises in a system where consciousness has nowhere else to direct attention but into defense. When attention ceases to fixate on threat, the surplus does not form. Without surplus, there is no collection. Without collection, there is no dependency. Archons and reversed entities do not leave because they are expelled, but because they remain without relationship. Their existence has always been conditional on interaction, not independence. In an environment where interaction loses its reactive character, their presence dissipates into the background. What appeared as dominion reveals itself as a temporary symbiosis based on specific conditions. The planet enters a phase where consciousness is no longer constantly stimulated to defend. Not because challenges vanish, but because the way they are processed changes. Where instant inner pressure once arose, there now emerges distance. This distance is not passivity, but the absence of a need to react according to old patterns. The end of the parasitic field does not mark the beginning of a perfect world. It marks the end of a world maintained exclusively through fear. Without this fuel, reality does not collapse, but reorganizes. A space emerges where consciousness does not need to generate surplus to have value. Archonic bridges and bridges of reversed entities were always one-sided. They led from humans to structures incapable of creating, only responding to gain. When the flow stops, the bridge has no reason to exist. Its collapse is not punishment, but the logical consequence of a change in current. Loosh thus becomes not taboo, but a historical phenomenon. Something that arose in specific conditions and fades along with them. Its end is not a celebration, but a quiet closure of the cycle. A cycle in which fear was long considered a necessary tool of order. The planet no longer needs this type of order. Not because it is morally advanced, but because the way consciousness interacts with reality is changing. Archonic structures and all reversed entities in this environment become incompatible. Their disconnection is therefore a consequence, not a goal. What remains is not emptiness, but a neutral field in which meanings are no longer automatically generated from fear. In this field, Loosh does not form because there is nothing from which to draw. And without Loosh, the parasitic model loses all sense. If you understand this, welcome to the club.